It's 2 a.m. Welcome back, and let's talk about meta and more specifically new characters. I understand that a lot of people are going to be pulling for characters like Dan Feng, as in the 5-star variation of Dan Heng, and probably going to be going for somebody like Fu Xuan, especially if you're running mono quantum teams. And I want to talk about these characters briefly, but I also just want to talk about why you should generally be going for units, not necessarily based on their meta performance, but instead what they do, what they can offer to you long term, and if you legitimately like them. I'm somebody with a lot of characters. E2 Sealy, E6 Silverwolf, I already have Blade, I have Kafka, I have Jing Yuan, and so on. I have a lot of characters, and I legitimately have built up a decent amount of them, at least, to a decent degree. But I skipped a few. I skipped characters like Luocha. I'm going to be skipping Dan Feng. I'm going to be skipping Fu Xuan as well, just because I generally don't think these characters are going to be very worthwhile for my account. And I want to talk about why, and I generally want to speak on how characters are viewed and perceived as in terms of the meta, and whether or not they're worthwhile for you as an individual, especially if you're free to play. First and foremost, I think the prime suspect of a 5-star limited unit that people maybe don't like as much now is Jing Yuan. Is he bad? No. But has he fallen off a bit in comparison to other units? Yes. Characters like Kafka have beaten him out in terms of AoE damage. Characters like Blade have as well. But I do legitimately think that it's important to consider just how differently Jing Yuan was perceived on release compared to now. Because I want to be clear, this wasn't a full year that went along where you can say, well, he was released 1 year ago, so it's obvious his position has changed. No, it was a situation to where the next banner characters, as in somebody like Silverwolf and somebody like Blade, characters who could deal damage, were better than him. And the next damage dealing characters, that being Blade and Kafka, were significantly better than him in AoE scenarios. Especially if we're looking at Kafka because of the same elements. I don't want it to be perceived that Jing Yuan is a bad unit. I instead want to talk about why it's important to evaluate a unit in terms of what they can offer you just based on their kit alone. I think that HSR has a bigger problem in terms of content creation and in terms of how characters are viewed. Memory of Chaos, as you can see here, does essentially favor the banner unit. In this instance, it's damage over time, because damage over time is great for characters like Kafka, like Sampo, and so on. And I think that generally what we've seen is characters that are on banner have an MOC that favors them and Simulated Universe that is basically whatever you want it to be at the time. And even though you could theoretically go through MOC and ignore the abundance blessing or the blessing that is that turn rotation, you can't necessarily evaluate the on banner unit without testing them there. And compared to Genshin, there is a much bigger gap in terms of what bonuses a unit will get from Memory of Chaos than there is in Genshin Impact. Jing Yuan, at that time, not only had a Memory of Chaos bonus that affected him and did wonderful things for his damage, but also the enemies favored him. If I'm just looking here, and I'm just looking at MOC, and I just ignore the blessing up here, and we're just talking about units, this overall is going to favor him, and more specifically in this instance, it's going to favor characters like Jing Yuan and Kafka specifically, because of the elements. When you have a unit that's on banner, the enemies in that rotation are essentially set up to where whatever on banner unit is going to perform exceptionally well. In this instance, a lot of units, enemies will be weak to lightning. Why? Because Kafka is a lightning character. And so I think it's important to look at that before talking about the units and how valuable they are. Because if you're taking away this blessing, and if we're actually trying to evaluate this character, it's very difficult to do so. I think Jing Yuan as a unit could and probably is just fine. Obviously, he may be more or less dependent on his light cone, especially if you have a signature, but he is still a fine unit. The problem is, he was hyped up to be so incredibly strong, especially on release, that people summoned for him expecting him to be amazing, and the moment another character came out that beat him, and another character that came out that beat him, it kind of defeats the purpose of having him as such a powerful unit, because Erudition is supposed to be AoE, and yet how is he, theoretically at least, one of the worst performing AoE units we have in the game? I think that in terms of new character releases, every character is so hyped up in terms of their value, whether or not you should pull, their comparisons to another, how strong they are, and what they offer, that it's very difficult to weed through all that and determine if a unit is legitimately worth it for you. If you're looking at Blade and you're comparing him in, retrospect to somebody like Jing Yuan, Blade is easier to build. But if you're comparing Jing Yuan to somebody like Serval, then you obviously have differences, especially with Serval having Eidolons you can more easily obtain, but they're of the same element and the exact same path, Erudition. And it's also so difficult to get past all of that and determine, is a unit legitimately valuable? Because a lot of times what you're going to see is this unit is amazing, this unit is broken, and Yes, they may be in one specific composition or in one specific area or type of content, and they can perform exceptionally well, but there aren't universal situations where you can use one unit in that specific way all the time. And so I legitimately want to speak on and have a discussion about what makes a unit good, whether you should pull, and how to evaluate if a unit is going to be good for your account. I don't believe in the idea that you should have to pull for one unit, hypothetically in this instance, let's say Silverwolf, to make another unit work. Let's say for Seele to be really good, she had to be paired with Silverwolf. That, in my opinion, would make Seele a bad character because she's dependent on another 5-star you have to get. Now, that's hypothetical, but I don't believe that one unit should virtually require another unit to be viable. I don't think that's fair to any individual, especially free players who have limited resources. We haven't hit that wall yet, but I also don't think it's fair to have a unit that depends on their light cone, especially their signature ones. If you're having a unit, and let's say hypothetically, this unit is Silverwolf, and she as a unit is fine-ish, but she has immense problems, and her light cone fixes all of those issues. I don't think that's fair. A light cone should be a bonus to a character's base existing kit, but it shouldn't inherently be the thing that fixes already existing problems in their kit. One of the reasons I don't like HSR's leveling system in comparison to Genshin is because you have to level to get specific things that should be included in their kits at basic value, at a basic standpoint from E0 level 1. That being, you have to get the attack, you have to get the quantum damage bonus, which in Genshin is the equivalent to elemental damage bonus. You have to get their major traces, which would normally be obtained in Genshin by just ascending them. And so, if I'm looking at a unit, and an example being, let's say hypothetically, Bronny was a 5-star limited character, and she had energy regeneration problems and skill point economy issues, but her light cone fixed all of those. I think instead, a light cone should be a bonus on what the essential purpose of that unit is, whether that's buffing, whether that's damage, whatever the case may be. I don't believe a light cone should inherently fix problems that you are going to have with a unit. If a unit has problems that can be mitigated by other units, I think that's different because you can build a team around that individual character. But if a character inherently has a problem that's solved by the signature, then I think they're an incomplete character because you're essentially asking for individuals to pull for units, pull for the light cone to get them to a better baseline standpoint, to get them to a usable state. So if we're talking about Jing Yuan, if we're talking about him as a unit, and we're looking at his character kit and we're looking at what he has access to, and we're saying his signature light cone is so good and so valuable that without him he's essentially an incomplete character, that is just a bad character because there are no good alternatives for you. Now this isn't necessarily saying this is true, but this is just an example I wanted to use. I think that when looking at further characters, especially when we go into characters like Fu Xuan, especially when we're going into characters like Dan Feng, who I will always say is Dan Feng because I'm not going to pronounce his actual name. What is this? Is it Imbibitor Lunai? I don't know. I don't feel like trying to memorize it or get it correct in terms of pronunciation. But regardless of that point, I think that when evaluating units, you're obviously going to have a lot of hype surrounding them, especially new releases. Kafka, amazing. Damage over time. Is she? Is she really amazing? Does she require you to have other units built to be amazing? Or is she just good by herself? Blade, same thing applies. Especially as we go into characters like Fu Xuan, is she only good in mono quanta teams? Is she only good for certain units? Or is she just a generally good support, especially as a preservation unit? If she's generally a good support as a preservation unit and does her job well, then she's a good unit. But if she requires you to slot her in to a specific team with specific elements or with a specific character, she's not necessarily a good unit. She's a fine one, not broken, not amazing, because that implies that she is so good at as a individual character that you should pull for her and be able to see the value of it inertly. And I just don't think that applies to everybody. And I don't want individuals to be in a position to where they hear so much about how great a character is that they feel like they have to pull for them and end up disappointed. I think that HSR has arguably a worse situation with hype than Genshin does, but I think that the difference is Genshin is 3 years old and people are much more inclined to hate on the game and say it's bad or say a character's just okay. Whereas in HSR, every character is amazing. But we have such a small roster that it's kind of difficult to actually evaluate them. But that's just my opinion. Tell me yours down below. You can entirely differ from me, and I understand if you do. But I just wanted to give my thoughts on this generally. I understand that I have a bunch of different units, and my account may be in a different position than you. But I do think it's at least worthwhile discussing, especially as we go into the next 2 banners. Either way, if you enjoyed, leave a like down below, consider subscribing, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.